Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome to the Networking RX podcast. I'm your host, Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Today, we have a wonderful guest. As my ongoing subscribers know on this podcast, often I'm sharing ideas and insights, but occasionally I will bring in people who are subject matter experts, authors, speakers, thought leaders, social scientists, and we just kind of kick around the notion of networking. Today, before I introduce my guest, what I want to do is I want to talk about how I came to meet him. Early in 2020, just shortly after the, it was before the COVID lockdown, I'd met a woman, Kimberly Rice, who is based in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. And she does a lot of things with women empowerment, and we got to know one another, and I was on her podcast and she was on mine. And she has written a book called Rainmakers, and she does a lot of work with attorneys. But at one point, Kimberly introduced me to a gentleman in New York City by the name of Scott Mason. And if you listen to this podcast, you know I've interviewed Scott, and I've been on Scott's podcast as well. And we've introduced each other to lots of different people. And one of the people that he introduced me to was another woman another person I had on my podcast, a woman by the name of Sejal Thacker. And her episode just came out recently. And Sejal and I got to know one another. And Sejal is a former attorney who does a lot of work with companies on diversity and inclusion. We got to know one another. And at one point, she introduced me to an individual by the name of Brian Bashan, who I'm going to be releasing his interview here shortly, interviewing him shortly. Interestingly enough, Brian Bashan knows Scott Mason. So this is all connected together. And Brian and I are talking, and I've connected Brian to some people, and he said, "Man, you just remind me so much of Simon Town." And then he connected me to Simon, and Simon's my guest. And I'll let Simon kind of talk about himself, but Simon is over in the UK. He's over in Yorkshire, which if you're not, it's on the eastern side of the UK and correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, you're up by the North Sea. If you head out across the North Sea, you'll hit Denmark, start hitting Scandinavian countries. So people think of the UK, they think of London. You know, there's so much more to the UK than London, or Ireland. But anyhow, welcome to the program. I guess I want to hear how you got to Brian and ultimately connected to me.
Well, just to give you an idea of where I am in the UK, I'm on the Yorkshire coast, so northeast England, in a small town called Scarborough. And my story is very strange with the connection, because my town's in the middle of nowhere. We get a lot of tourists, but there's not very much else going on. Now, I have a mentor called Keith Madeley who ultimately introduced me to Brian, but the story, again, is one of these multiple steps of interconnectivity. So Brian was introduced to the UK by a gentleman named Johnny Polwick to a networking group I'm part of called Intelligence Forums. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to meet him on that particular event because I had other things going on in my life. Honestly, don't tell Harry, but I completely forgot it was on. Anyway, while he was at that event, Harry introduced him to Keith Madeley, who was my mentor, a gentleman who goes by the name Mr. Yorkshire. And by that, Keith introduced me to Brian. And it was very strange because I had never talked to anyone overseas properly before. I'd always kept my networking UK-based. And the relationship with Brian grew because who ever meets Brian will understand he's a wonderful human being. And Brian just messaged me one day saying, "Simon," he says, "I need to introduce you to Frank." I said, "Okay, who's Frank?" He said, "Well, he's in Ohio, and basically he's you 20 years from now, American, and better looking." And I was just like, okay, Brian, I'd like to speak to Frank. This sounds interesting. You know, spent some time in America when I was younger, but I was just a teenager and a student, and I thought, see where this goes. And that brings you to where I am today, from a small town in England, speaking to you from halfway across the world through a connection of multiple people. But it also turns out I know Johnny Palwick, I know Harry very well, so every other person in the chain on this end is someone that I'm already talking to. So it's very strange.
Yeah, it's, you know, the whole, and I guess I credit COVID with it. The lockdown just kind of really opening our eyes and just really, you know, the necessity is the mother of invention, right? And the necessity of kind of making contacts and trying to keep our world alive while we're stuck at home or supposed to be stuck at home, has really kind of forced us out to be connected with other people. And, you know, for our listeners, the story doesn't end there. I mean, that's really kind of the beginning of the story, because Simon has started to connect me with people and I've connected him with people. I connected him with David Prayakahan, who's over in India. And I've got other people to connect him to, and he's done the same for me. He's connected me to people here in the United States. And it's funny, I tell people about meeting you, and they're like, "Oh, well, great. Who you got? You know, you're just going to meet more people in the UK." It's like, no, I'm meeting people in the United States that I would not have met. You know, I'm meeting a woman in Minnesota, you know, that I wouldn't have met. And my sister lives in Minnesota, you know, so same town. It's just this whole introduction, we'll call it the introduction economy, is just fascinating to me. Absolutely fascinating.
It really is, because you introduced me today to a lady over in India, and we had a wonderful conversation. And through that conversation, I've introduced her to a guy in Malawi in a tiny village that no one's ever heard of, who she can help. And it just shows that the global community now is becoming very close, and we're all learning that we're just people. And I like people. People have stories, and stories are interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting where it all goes. And before we hit record, we were talking about solving problems, and, you know, how we can solve so many problems because there's little bits of information out there scattered, as you put it, in tiny little towns that nobody's ever heard of. And through technology, those little bits of information and insights can all start to be pieced together.
Definitely. We have a saying in Yorkshire called slowly, slowly, catchy monkey. And most people probably can't understand my accent anyway, because Yorkshire is a very strange accent, and it's not as broad as most people's is. But the entire saying is basically, if you take your time and take small steps, you will catch a monkey. If you chase after a monkey, it will run off. I worked in a zoo, trust me on this. It will run off. You will be running around like a headless chicken for hours and then chasing it from place to place to place. But if you take small steps, careful movements, and basically link everything together, for instance, with us, it's about 6-7 degrees of separation. Eventually, things will fall into place, and you will meet that person or catch your monkey.
Yeah, that's. I've written it down. I've written it down. I will. I'm going to use that on my micro podcast. I'm going to do a whole episode on that. I will share that with you when it comes out. But no, I think it's so true that while we can solve all the problems, it's not immediate, you know. And and I think a lot of times people, I had somebody email me yesterday. Hey, they sent me their brochure and they said, here, send this out to all your friends. And I'll make a donation for every client I close. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. It's not that immediate. I need to get to know you. I need to figure out, I'm not just going to blast this out to everybody, because you can only do that so many times without losing credibility. And these connections need to be done one at a time, slowly to capture your phrase there.
Yeah, I also find when it comes to introductions to people, if you sell into them, they're not going to be interested. My approach to networking is very much a situation of, I want to find out about you. I want to find out what you're doing, what you're about. And I have massive social anxiety and Asperger's, so I've broken everything down into a system. And I've told Frank about this before. To me, networking, I have a little game that I play that helps me cope. And it's reaping a lot of rewards because I'll talk to you, I will listen to everything that you're saying because I am so scared that I will forget something. But while we're talking, I will be thinking in the back of my mind, okay, these are the kind of people that he would be interested in talking to. This is what they're doing. Who do I know who is looking to talk to someone with these skills? So, for example, today, just chatting with Frank beforehand, my game is always a case of trying to introduce 3 people. And while we're chatting before this, we both know someone of 3 people each, and we've both got a contact there that will benefit from talking to that contact. Now, me and Frank have got nothing to gain from this, but these 5-minute favors, as you've used on your own podcasts before, in your micro podcasts, for individuals in the networking world, that 5-minute favor could change someone else's life. Yeah. And hoarding your connections and not introducing people who can solve other people's problems, then quite honestly, in my opinion, you're being selfish. And the selfish networker won't get any connections.
No, you're absolutely true. I mean, as you're talking, there's a couple people I need to introduce you to because I know a woman down in Miami, Florida, who is the female version of us. Berta Medina, I will connect you to her because I had a conversation with Berta Medina, and woke up the next day. She's up at like 5 a.m. U.S. time. And I wake up and look at my email and I have 10 connections to, really wonderful people. And nobody's a lottery ticket. Nobody changed my life, but they all kind of sent me on a different trajectory. One guy he's a business coach over in Canada, who has taught me so many wonderful things. And it's just amazing. So I will make that happen. Berta, if you're listening, by the time this comes out, it'll have happened. But I guess when did you kind of discover this whole making connections thing? Did Keith kind of teach this to you?
Yes and no. So I'm 29 and I was thrown into the world of networking in the deep end at the age of 19. I was an undergraduate and my background originally was fitness industry. And although I'm a qualified ecologist, that's what my day job is still. I work in the fitness industry. And it was strange because my mum turned around to me and said, Simon, I'm taking you to a networking event in a small town that no one's ever heard of called Stocksbridge. But not only that, a tiny little shed in the middle of a lake area where they were having a small networking group for people around the Sheffield, Stocksbridge area. And for most of you, you'll be going, where the heck's this? And we ask that in the UK, don't worry about it. Most of us don't have a clue where Stocksbridge is. And those of us do know where it is, try and run away as fast as we can. But I remember going into that room full of professionals in a tracksuit where everyone else is in a suit and just standing by the buffet freezing. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say, didn't know who any of these people were. They didn't want to talk to me, and I was panicking because social anxiety, Asperger's, you're not good in these situations. But one of the things that is interesting is that by doing that and getting that fear out of the way at a young age, as my career progressed and my own journey progressed, I found that gradually I could phase into people. And Keith comes into my life about 7 years after this. I was about 26, 27. And I've got an idea for a company. And I wanted to learn a bit more about networking. But Keith actually brought me in because his wife writes children's books. So I met Keith because of my ecology background. My mum knew Keith. I came in to help advise on a children's book. And basically he adopted me as someone that he wanted to invest time in. So we went to a networking event in September 3.5 years ago now in Leeds in the UK. And I remember where it was. It was an accountancy office called Sedulo. I walked in there, knew no one in the room apart from my mum who was presenting. A gentleman named Harry Corbett, who runs the IF that I keep introducing people to. He was hosting the event and Keith came in. And Keith and Harry stayed with me and made me feel comfortable and introduced me to a few people that could be helpful because I was starting my journey and starting my own career, starting my own business. And since then, both of them have been part of my life. Those of you who know the UK will know that the north of England isn't particularly rich. And the one of the strangest things I find about all this is that I've been to events where Keith's been the guest of honor, and I've been there going, but it's just Keith. And everyone's going, but no, he's Mr. Yorkshire. That's what his job title is, by the way, Mr. Yorkshire. He's got his MBE, all these kind of things. Amazing human being. But to me, he's always just going to be Keith. And what he did was introduce me to a few people, introduce me to a few more people, started inviting me to events with him, to attend with him. And very softly, he was just showing me how to do it. And by that, I mean, it was, he found out about people. He made everyone that he talked to feel special. He found out who they were, what they did. And then he went, oh, I know someone that will make your day. And he would just throw a name at them. I will make an introduction. And then you get an email a day later with the introduction to the person. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. You know, this is a really good way of doing it. And I started mimicking him with his altruistic approach to networking. Beforehand, I didn't know what I was doing. I'd talk to people, but it never really went anywhere. And then I found by introducing people to each other and trying to remove myself out of the center, I was suddenly the center of a networking group, because suddenly I was the one that people were coming to speak to. I'd gone from being the young gentleman who no one knew, who was wearing a tracksuit, to now a young guy wearing a suit that everyone goes, oh, well, he won't be worth your time. And then the people that I was talking to would talk to other people and go, you need to talk to him because he knows some people that I needed to know. He might know someone that can help you.
Right.
And 3 years later, I'm talking halfway across the world to Frank.
Yeah, it can happen that quickly. I mean, 3 years is really a short amount of time. And people would be amazed that, you know, one or two connections, one or two conversations a month, over a year is, people try to do the math. Well, okay, if I have one conversation a month, that's 12 people. No, it actually becomes a whole lot more than that, because those conversations lead to other people. It almost gets to a point where you can't keep up on it. I mean, that was my sensation, within 12 hours of talking to you and 12 hours of talking to Berta. I don't know if I can keep up on this. And eventually you do, it kind of settles in. And not every contact leads to more contacts. There are dead ends. And sometimes for good reason. But yeah, it's, it can snowball in a great way. I guess let's shift gears here quickly. You're working in the fitness industry, but and that's great. That pays the bills. But what's your bigger aspiration? People listening, hey, I'm looking to do this, or, how could we help you?
So I'll give you a bit of a background to myself as well here. When I was 16, I was hit by a lorry walking home from school and almost killed. Okay,
what's a lorry?
A lorry, an 8-wheeler.
Okay.
I think the word that you'd call it.
Yeah, okay.
Big rig.
Yep.
And he was speeding, he hit a bridge, and he jackknifed and pretty much wiped me out. And I was 16 years old. It was January the 7th, 2008 at 20 minutes to 4. And I spent quite a lot of time in a wheelchair on crutches, and I have PTSD. I've had it most of my life. And that took me on a strange journey of bad times, good times, filled of friends killing themselves, those kind of things, alcohol abuse. I've got myself back on my feet, don't get me wrong. It wasn't a nice few years, but it shaped my personality. And even with my career in the fitness industry, my entire company is a not-for-profit. And what we do is we work with companies to help improve their health and well-being, and then use the money we make from that to support people in rural and disadvantaged communities across the UK, and now in Africa, in Malawi as well. And basically, my life is no longer, even Roots, I love it to bits. We call Roots of Idris, he'll never try and spell it. I love it to bits what I do with that, but even then, it's only part of what I want to do. And my journey is just this. I want to meet interesting people, find out their stories, and make their lives a little bit better. I read something a few years ago, and I can't remember where, but it said that the meaning of life is the number of people who have benefited from your living. And I try and live my life every day by that. And then about 2 months ago, Brian Bashand introduced me to a gentleman from the UK who lives in Canada and spent some time with the Inuits, called Paul Rogers. And he gave me another one, which was that your tragedy is someone else's survival guide. And that really affected me as well. And I guess when it comes to networking, talking to people, or anything that I want to do in life, I just want to make the world a little bit better place. I mean, if I can help someone anywhere and it takes me 5 minutes, takes me a few hours, I'll do it.
Yeah.
You know, as long as I can feed my family, as long as I can have a roof over my head and live a comfortable life, I'll go out of my way to help people, even if it loses me sleep.
No, I think it's very noble. And you're like me. I tell people I believe in karma, right? I believe I have good days, and they seem to come out of nowhere, clients or whatever. And I have to remind myself that it doesn't come out of nowhere. I just can't see all the dots connected, as you put it. We were talking before we recorded. You referred to it as the dot to dot approach. Yeah,
the dot to dot approach. Everyone's a dot on a larger picture, and all you've got to do is connect the dots to get to the end of it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not obvious how, point A, to get from point A to point B, it seems like the shortest path, but really the path to it is going to C to D to E to M, to all sorts of things to get yourself back to B, because from A to B doesn't work for whatever reason. There's a gatekeeper in between or whatever it might be.
And I think that leads on to another point of things with networking, and that is you've got to learn how to handle rejection. Because not everyone that you talk to will be interested in talking to you, and not every lead will work out. And when I first started networking, I found that someone, for instance, introduced me a HR manager who just didn't want to give me the time of day. It was hurtful because I take things very personally, probably because I'm not, I've got mental health issues myself anyway. So it's very easy to make my pint glass overflow with emotion. And learning how to deal with the idea, okay, not every lead's going to pay off. Like you said earlier, some of them are dead-end leads. Mm-hmm. When you're starting out, learning that the hard way it takes a while, because you're there going, every conversation is going to be like a conversation with Frank or with Brian. But when you start to learn that not every conversation will do that, and some people will benefit from it and more than others in a conversation, and accept that, you become better at what you do, because suddenly you start thinking, okay, it doesn't matter that it's not helped me, it's helped someone else. And by changing your mindset to, okay, that one's not worked out, but something else might do in future, and looking for the positive outlook out of it all and the lessons learned, then you can go on and make something better from it.
Yeah. I have the mindset, Simon, that when somebody doesn't want to talk to me, that it's really their loss. Because like you, I come into conversations with an open mind and an open heart. How can I help this person? How can I do something for them, or how can they benefit somebody else I might know, which in turn benefits them. And so if they don't want to have that conversation with me, they're the ones who've lost. They just don't know it. They have no clue as to what they've lost, and I just move on.
I completely agree with that. And when I look at some people who were in my life when I was in my worst, who I no longer have anything to do with because they tried to keep me at my worst, they're the ones who've missed out.
Yeah.
Because I'm talking to people like you now, and they're struggling, trying to figure out what to do the next day. And I'll be honest with you, since I've started doing this, I've never been happier.
Yeah.
I found a place where I belong. I found a place where I have a role. I'm just a cog in a larger machine, and I accept that, and I love that. I love being a cog, because a cog's got a meaning.
Yeah. Well, this is great. No, I really appreciate your time. To be continued. I'm sure we'll talk again. Kind of an update on the adventures of Simon Town and Frank Agan and all the different connections that we're going to head each other into.
At some point, I'm going to drag you into a new UK networking event, and you're going to see how we do it.
All right. I'll take you up on that. That'll be great. I appreciate your time here today.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.